Welcome everyone to another session of the Colorado Plateau Dark Sky Cooperative's Quarterly Connections. Today we will be continuing our discussion on the topic of night-friendly outdoor lighting, part 2. We will be taking a deeper dive into the policies and implementation from the perspective of 2 internationally recognized dark sky communities. If you missed part 1 on this subject, I encourage you to check the Quarterly Connections website to find the recording of the meeting we had last March when we covered advancements in technology, planning, and design. The goal of this educational series is to build a community, to foster connections, and broaden a collective understanding of matters related to the dark night sky and its management. We hope with this forum we can all learn and support one another and ultimately be more effective in our unique roles and mission. Thank you to my colleagues with the Cooperative and the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism at Utah State University for your support of this series and presentation today. My name is Lisa Stoner. I am the coordinator of the Colorado Plateau and Basin Range Dark Sky Cooperatives. Anil Seth is a member of the Cooperative and is my co-host today, who will be facilitating the Q&A following the presentations. Thank you, Anil. Some quick logistics. We record all quarterly connections and post the links to the recordings on our website. Also, this meeting is being offered in connection with the Utah and Nevada chapters of the American Planning Association. If you are an APA member interested in receiving continuing education credits, I will drop a code in the chat at the end of this meeting for you. I am pleased to announce our very special guest today. First, we'll hear from Alexi Lamb, the Director of Sustainability for the City of Moab. Since starting in this position in 2022, Alexi helped finalize the city's sustainability plan and submitted their application to become a dark sky community. Corey Shirtliff, the city planner for Moab, unfortunately was not able to attend today, but we are so thankful that Alexi has offered to present for the 2 of them. I know Alexi will be getting into this in her talk today, and not to steal her thunder, but this is an exciting time for the city of Moab because they just announced last week by the Dark Sky International that Moab is now another certified dark sky community. So great to have you, Alexi. Our second presenter is Dr. Christian Luginbuehl. Chris is a founding member and president of the Flagstaff Dark Sky Coalition, and he is a principal with Dark Sky Partners, LLC. He's a retired astronomer and is recognized as one of the foremost authorities on light pollution and dark sky lighting. Simply stated, Chris has been a principal author of many outdoor lighting codes since 1989. As many of you know, Flagstaff was the first international dark sky city recognized by Dark Sky International in 2001. And with his ongoing efforts and with his colleagues with the Flagstaff Dark Sky Coalition, as their community is approaching 75,000 people, we honor that dedication, knowledge, and expertise that he has to bring to us today. So thank you, Chris. And finally, time for our presentations. So thank you to our speakers for this opportunity to hear from you. And Alexi, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Okay, thank you. As Lisa said, I'm the Sustainability Director for the City of Moab, and my colleague Corey Shirtliff is really sorry he couldn't make it today and is very willing to answer questions. So I'll show his contact information later in case anybody wants to talk to the planner in Moab City. So I'll be filling in for him. And my plan is to go through what we've learned as we've adopted and implemented outdoor lighting code in our city and what it's taken to implement and enforce that code. For context, we're looking at the city main street of Moab during the day in this image. Oops. And this is Moab by night from Schaefer Point and Canyonlands National Park, which is nearby. For a small place, we have a big impact on a lot of things, but you can see our sky glow there on the horizon. So this area of southeastern Utah is known for its proximity to state parks, national parks, the Colorado River, off-roading, mountain biking trails, and a variety of other outdoor recreation. So many people may have visited Moab, and we're a relatively small city just by ourselves. We have about 5,000 permanent residents and another 5,000 or so in the county around us. So the outsized impact from our community comes from millions of visits per year to Moab for those opportunities that we have, including viewing the night sky, as well as the lodging and the food and the retail and the tours that serve those people. So despite a slowly growing population, a little over 1% per year, the glow of Moab is increasing with development. So this image is showing Moab on the left side of each map, with neighboring communities on the southern end of the Moab Valley area, and also the glow that's coming from Grand Junction, which you can kind of see up there in the northeast corner. If we could see more on this map out to the west, you could also potentially see some light from mining operations that are nearby. So this trend towards more light shining up in the sky is one that the city has wanted to address for some time. This was being discussed as early as 2002. Though efforts lacked support in the beginning, and the first time around, maybe the second time around, we are definitely around the block a few times with this effort. The city finally started getting some more momentum in 2016. The idea that we could manage the impact of our lights finally caught when there was a joint meeting of the Moab City Council and Grand County Planning Commission with some local community members who were interested in seeing this move. By this time, several nearby parks had already become dark sky places, and a few years later, in 2019, Moab passed an outdoor lighting ordinance. It wasn't until this spring, though, as Lisa said, that we finally became a dark sky community. So it did take us a really long time to get here. And I think that process is something that we can share for communities that are having a little trouble getting traction, or who are somewhere in that process, maybe faster or slower. And that even unique communities like we all are can have common challenges. So going back to 2002, Moab's first discussion of becoming a dark sky community, we just couldn't get the community support at that time to make this initiative a priority. So the next time, or maybe the one after that, after that this came up again, it was obvious that we needed more community-led efforts, not one that was led by state parks or national parks, one that really became grassroots, and it needed resident support in order for it to get the traction it needed to go through city council. And in a place where residents can feel a lot like their lives revolve around visitors, this needed to be something that benefited the people who call Moab home. So the nonprofit in our area that works with the national parks, the Friends of Arches and Canyonlands National Parks, as well as community advocates, came together and ended up being the champions for this final successful effort. And this led to star parties, art shows, open houses, videos through the Tourism Council, a lot of things to build support within the community to make this happen. And it eventually did demonstrate to the community the value of better lighting and darker skies. Once the idea had momentum, the city had some work to do. The goal was to have better lighting and for us to have darker skies. At some point, I think people weren't sure if we could actually get to the designation, but just the process was going to have enough value that it was worth it. So as it turned out, we could have both, but it became important enough to the community that even if we couldn't get to an official designation, this was still worth pursuing. This checklist includes a lot of the things that we were thinking about to make our case that Moab also could get to a designation. And today, the focus is on the first two, code and compliance with the code that we were passing. Okay, so the original ordinance basically covered the principles of good lighting. Following the model ordinance the Dark Sky has, which addressed when light's necessary, how much light, when lights should be on, the color of those lights and things like that. So a lot of this is pretty standard for communities that are looking at this. That model ordinance is a place that we started. As we went through trying to use that, it became more complicated. The ordinance was passed and it became enforced in 2019, but we started discovering aspects of the code that were difficult for us to review in plans or impractical for us to enforce on the ground. Especially since dark skies were only one of the goals of the community. Locals cared a lot about light trespass again, too. And so the more horizontal issues that affect lesser night sky, but did affect people next to them, were a big issue with our community and started becoming issues with our compliance, reporting, and enforcement. So in 2023, last year, we addressed both issues, the issues with the actual ordinance, and then also the amortization date that was a challenge. And Moab, like a lot of gateway communities, had a bust and a boom during COVID. We also have a high staff turnover. So several positions with the city were vacant during this period, making it harder to have continuity in our efforts. And the 2023 update included changing some of those issues that were difficult to review or to enforce, and also extended the amortization date to give everyone, including the city, a chance to get their lighting in order. So these revisions included laying out a clear purpose that led to our more efficient compliance or enforcement, and also defining direct lighting and temporary lighting in ways that we could review and enforce, which also helped us define better when lights should be just off. The basic provision of the ordinance didn't change, not dramatically, but some changes helped our city staff with implementation. And I want to also note that it became like a topic of discussion whether we wanted to progress our code along and make it maybe more aggressive or move the color temperature of lights down from what was 3000 Kelvin. And we felt like it became a choice between our amortization date, whether we wanted to keep an amortization date at all, even if we extended it, or if we wanted to have a more adaptable code, because we didn't want to have a moving finish line for people if we had an amortization date. It seemed like it was important that for people who were being proactive and trying to get their lighting to code, that we didn't keep moving the finish line. So when given the option of getting rid of an amortization date or having a more flexible code or having a less flexible code in the long, over time, and keeping the amortization date, a lot of our advocates were in favor of keeping the amortization date and trying to keep the standards as continuous as possible in order to be sure that eventually our city did reach some sort of finish line isn't really a good word for this, but that we got to the point that we did have lights that were facing down and compliant with our code. So this image that we're looking at has lights visible from a second story. There are also some other issues with lighting in this, of course, but the elevations were becoming an issue with people who were complaining because our code at the time was saying that if you could see a light, that it was not compliant. And so even lights that were kind of recessed up into a ceiling or that were dark sky compliant otherwise were creating issues for people who were at a different elevation and could still see the light. And that's going to become important as I start talking about some of the changes that we made to code. Okay, so I'll start with the purpose, which explains where we had some tension points. Like many residents of communities who have been pursuing dark sky designations, people in Moab care about dark skies, but they also care about safety and security, like many people do. And a tension point was, like I mentioned before, that we were finding that the city had a real concern about light trespass, that this was an issue among neighbors in town and the types of complaints that our compliance office was getting. Thus, the code revision, we made it clear that it was addressing issues of light trespassing on neighbor properties in addition to the sky. We had a whole list of goals. This is actually only a few of the goals that are listed in the code, but these are the ones that are maybe most relevant to what we're discussing today. And we'll talk a bit about how that played out when we started defining things. So the clarification called for these enforceable definitions, our code update. And previously the code had indicated, as I mentioned, that a light visible off property was an issue with our code. And that wasn't always the case with dark sky, like compliant fixtures. Sometimes they were more of an issue of where people were located and where they were looking. So our planning department came up with a definition of direct illumination, defining it as a high intensity cone of light where it was in the highest concentration. And this helped us with complaints about fixtures that were otherwise compliant, and were not directing light off their property, but could be visible. So we had a cutoff that our staff could clearly follow if they were looking at a situation that on the ground, they could figure that out. And this also helped us with complaints that usually happen without, let's say, a photometric plan that we would have in a new construction. In new constructions, we have a pretty clear idea of where lights are aimed and where the light would be. But with a lot of our existing buildings, it was harder to tell. And having this direct illumination definition gave the city staff a measurable boundary for lighting when they were looking at complaints from people. Another definition that ended up being important was temporary lighting and holiday temporary lighting, string and otherwise. Our previous code had some allowances for partially or unshielded fixtures, like limits with lumens that we could review in a new construction plan. In the revision, we made a harder cutoff. It either is shielded or it isn't. And then we had a shut-off time for temporary lighting. For any light that is legal and non-conforming, meaning it's not necessarily dark sky compliant yet, the shutoff is at 10 p.m. And that includes holiday lighting that is temporary, that is not shielded as well. And then we do have some places that have installed dark sky compliant lighting that is temporary and string, and they have to comply with the rest of the code, but they don't have the same time cutoffs, other than that businesses have to turn off their lights an hour after they close. So this was simpler for enforcement. Again, it got us to a practical solution for reviews that we could do with new construction and photometric plans or calculating lumens for unshielded fixtures, which we used to have to do. But just having a strict cutoff and a clear definition about what is not shielded made it a lot easier to define what can exist and what can't. Okay, so once we updated the code, we needed to be serious about our own city's lighting to set an example. The decorative lights on Main Street and the city buildings ended up being the easiest place for us to start because we own and operate them. Our other street lights are utility owned and we pay them to do that. So there's still in negotiations and discussions about switching them out and how to do that. But we could make an impact much sooner with the stuff that the city had direct control over. So after a pilot in which we solicited community feedback, we have a full retrofit forthcoming on our decorative fixtures that are going up and down Main Street. And we made a concerted effort to publicize that this change would benefit the community and also meet some of the goals that we had set forth and that were important to people who live here. Like we're not removing lighting altogether. We're augmenting it so it faces down. It'll be safe, but it'll also keep light from going upwards. And in addition, trying to emphasize that switching to these energy efficient fixtures would save money and maintenance over time, which was also a concern of people in Moab. So then we needed a clear path for the residents and how they would come into compliance with their city code. So this came in what our planner calls 3 punches. First is nuisance lighting with our code update became immediately enforceable. Literally glaring issues could be fixed with the code update. Next, most of the lighting is and was legally non-conforming. The process for changing that involves anything that's new will be new, in conformance with code from the beginning. Renovations will come into alignment with the code as they go through their permit review, and voluntary updates can also come in at that point. And hopefully getting all of this done before the amortization date in 2029. So this is just an example of a sign permit, the application that we could see come through the city and some of the comments that that person received on their application. And then this is what it looked like after it was installed. So a lot of these newer things are pretty easy to do on the front end because they're installed from the beginning correctly. And then we also have things like this, which are renovations coming through, and they can submit lighting schedules and photometric plans to review to ensure they meet code. So as buildings are renovated, they're also coming into compliance. Okay, so we also have some voluntary updates. We've had an HOA, the city is working on. We're trying to recruit more people to voluntarily update their lighting, so we don't have a city full of out of code lighting in 2029. So we've been working with our compliance team on getting information out so residents can identify when their own fixtures might need updating. And we've been working also with our nonprofit partner, which is still in play. They, Friends of Arches and Canyonlands, have stuck with us, and they created initially a grant-funded rebate program that they continue to support, and it provides financial assistance to Moab residents who are placing their lighting and need to offset some of that cost. Initially, that grant was based on energy and emission savings from retrofits. Now I believe that they are funding it through other sources. And the goal is that in 2029, that all the lights in Moab are facing downward and in compliance with code, providing residents and our visitors alike with health and safety benefits better lighting affords, as well as clearer views of the sky. So I'm going to wrap it up here. If we have a couple minutes for questions, I'm open to that. Or if we end up needing to push them to the very end of the presentation, that's fine too. I've included Corey's contact information here. He's really interested if people have code questions, and mine as well.
Alexi, thank you. Just to stay on time, we might want to take questions to the end. Thank you for sharing where you are now. Congratulations. This is going to be a really interesting juxtaposition to Flagstaff, which has been in the business for a long time. So we commend you for all your hard work, and Corey and all your advocates in your area. There were a couple questions. I know Anil is keeping track of those, but I'm going to go ahead and transition, if you don't mind, to Chris, if that's okay, everybody.
I wanted to say that I was very pleased to see that story about Moab. I had been involved with Moab back in the 90s, I believe, in Grand County. So you've made a lot of progress. It's great to see. I wanted to mention also that options for amortization or sunset clauses are dependent upon jurisdiction, and Flagstaff has to operate in a location where that is not on the plate due to state constitution. Anyway, so I want to start a little bit about the Flagstaff story. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me, and I think I'm very pleased to see all the attendance. I'll give a shout out to one or two members as I go through here because they're related to some of the work that you'll be seeing. So I want to talk a little about what Flagstaff has learned over 20 years. I'm not going to be presenting any surprises, I don't think, nothing new or things that you've never heard of before, but I think I may want to underscore or emphasize a few things differently than you commonly see. I want to begin. In the general picture, there is some bad news that we have to report. Beginning in about 2016, there was a report which I think many of us may have seen, indicating that the large fraction of North Americans could not see the Milky Way. Since then, it has not gotten better. Recent reports indicate that light pollution is getting worse, and it's getting worse quickly. Now, these are general measurements made across the country or around the world. There is no information that I'm aware of yet that specifically focuses on dark sky communities. Then that might be a different story there. I'm not sure it's a different story until it's demonstrated. So the bad news is skies are getting worse. But we know how to do better. We've been talking about this for 40 plus years, and simple estimates of the amount of benefits that you can get from some of the basic principles we talk about when we talk about dark sky friendly lighting. The three I've listed here out of the typical four, and you saw a different, slightly different list from Lisa's presentation. but I talk about often the right amount in the right place. And we used to talk about the right time, but I put the lowest impact spectrum as number 3. All 3 of those can be examined from models and measurements and can give you an estimate of how much of a benefit you can get if you can bring all of your lighting to have the amount of light that is appropriate. That actually turns out to be less dramatic, at least in the studies that I've done, than you might think. When you see an overlighted place, it certainly gets your attention. And I think the tendency is to think that overlighting is more predominant than it is. But in any case, and it may be worse today than it was when I did this study, but the benefit from that is about a 25% improvement to put caps on the way lighting is used so not too much is used. Shielding is less controversial. The amount of shielding that communities have on average, the typical direct uplight of communities that have not tried to regulate is about 10 to 15%. And if you remove that, that can make a 50% improvement in the darkness of your sky, or the amount of light pollution that gets into your sky. Finally, I can't go backwards. I was going to go spectrum. I don't know if I know how to go backwards with this. I apologize. Yes, I can. You can get a 70% improvement if you choose the spectrum wisely. And I'll underscore that a little bit more here as we go forward. If you combine all 3 of those together, that amounts to an expectation before you start of about 90% before you start making measurements. And now here I wanted to give a shout out to Ashley, who I noticed is attending, because she was the one who made the measurement on the top of this graph, on the top of this presentation. In 2016, we measured with the National Park Service camera system the brightness of the sky over the entire hemisphere from outside of Flagstaff. And we compared it to another town, which also has a park unit nearby. And the towns are, by luck, almost exactly the same size, excuse me. Our measurement distances were almost exactly the same. And it shows that Flagstaff glow over it is about 90% less. Almost exactly what was predicted by that analysis, which was done 5 to 10 years before. However, I have to say, as I mentioned before, that I don't know if other dark sky communities might also be doing well. I'm suspicious they may not be. Making these measurements is not something that's accessible to everybody. But in any case, we have one demonstrated success here. And that means that I think we might have some lessons to learn. How do we do that? There's no magic here, I wanted to say. There's nothing special or unusual or surprising about what we've done compared to the expectations and plans and goals of, as for example, just outlined by the Moab process. We need a quality lighting code. There's important parts about that that I've listed here. They need to be specific, concise, and effectively written so that they're enforceable. I heard Moab talking about the issues there. Amber lighting in the codes I'm talking about for Flagstaff is required, not encouraged. And that's a little bit more of that underlining of the topic that I don't think is new to anybody, but maybe a little bit more of an emphasis than most have seen. Strict shielding requirements and lighting caps on the amount. Overall, this gives them benefits that you have already outlined here: 70%, 50%, and 25% reduction in sky brightness. In order to make a code like that work, though, you need a broad and deep community support. And I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in for Moab, where you talked about how at the beginning you didn't have the community support and the grassroots awareness wasn't there, and it didn't fly. And as you created that, you were able to make it move forward. Nobody should expect that they can create a lighting code and then get its enforcement without that community support and without a community commitment to the resources necessary to make it work. Community resources like staff time, staff training, etc. What is the quality lighting code? Again, just to underscore it again, limits on the amount, limits on the shielding and the spectrum. Again, these give about a 90% improvement in the brightness of the night sky, or 90% improvement in the amount of light pollution or reduction. Now, this is one I've talked about. You'll see that the amber lighting is the largest standard. It's the largest benefit, 70%. And the dark sky communities in general, dark sky movement in general, recognizes that low blue content and amber lighting is something desirable. But unfortunately, that's been settled in a way which is not very effective for dark sky. For example, most communities talk about low color temperature white LEDs. What happens if we do that? If we go to 3000 Kelvin CCT of white LEDs, the lumen for lumen impact of that kind of light compared to what's most commonly being replaced, high pressure sodium, doubles the impact on sky glow. So if we instead if we take that amber lighting spectrum and instead go to warm white LEDs, you can see we can only expect about a 25% improvement in skies. I don't think that's going to be expected by many people. So back to the broad, deep community support that's critical to make a lighting code effective. I want to emphasize a little bit about what that means. In our culture, you know, there's lots of thoughts about how light contributes to our economies, our quality of life, how we need it to find our ways around, how we need it to feel safe or to be safe. Who isn't impressed by the beauty of a Christmas tree in the dark? Or illuminated historical structures. What we need to do as a movement is, besides getting lighting codes, is we need to help promote this community engagement with what I call the culture of night. There is a culture of night that's associated with a culture of light, but it is all the bad things about night. Night is dark, night is frightening, night is dangerous. We need to come forward with support of the idea that night is of value and contributes value to our quality of life and to our environment in and of itself, by the way it is naturally. We can do that with star parties. None of this is new ideas. Night hikes, need to engage the business community and help them understand the economic benefits of it. There is little that's easier to sell than the visibility and the wonder of the night sky. My favorite quote, which I use in nearly every presentation I give, from Henry Beston, points out in 1928, before any of us were ever thinking about this, in fact, before there was hardly any outdoor lighting, he pointed out this resonance of the night sky with your average person. When the great earth, abandoning day, rolls up the deeps of the heavens and the universe, a new door opens for the human spirit, and there are few so clownish that some awareness of the mystery of being does not touch them as they gaze. We can hook onto that and use that to help us promote and protect dark skies. In Flagstaff, we have been doing that for 25 years by an annual star party where we welcome about 1,000 people per night for 3 nights up in a park right adjacent to the city limits. We have also fostered fine art exhibits, juried exhibits, where we ask artists of all types across the country and around the world. We've had contributions all the way from Australia to interpret the night in a positive way. And it's so easy to do, and artists are so responsive to the idea. Just last month, at the last full moon rising, the flower moon rising, we had a concert, first of its kind, at least for Flagstaff. I'm sure it's a rare event anywhere to get a Steinway D concert grand piano out into a park, and nearly 300 to 400 people listened to a local dark sky supporter and retired astronomer like myself, David Kerner, play the Moonlight Sonata as the moon rose, and play Clair de Lune and other pieces related to the night. This is fostering the culture of night. And people resonate with it like you wouldn't believe, and I'm sure you all know. So, how can others do what Flagstaff has done? Every time we get up and try to move forward with protecting dark skies, I'm sure all of you have faced obstacles like the ones that I've listed here. I'm sure there are more that I've forgotten. There is a nearly unending list of objections to various aspects of our proposals to help protect the night. If we shield light or if we reduce it, is it safe? Is crime going to increase, etc.? Most of these have kernels of truth in them. In other words, they are related to real concerns, and light might be related to them. Many of them are very heavily influenced by the whole idea of the culture of light, and that being the flip side of the culture of light is that dark is an ominous and dark and dangerous thing. So how do we deal with that? I'm going to give a quick analogy. what if you want to learn about how gravity works? It's complicated, right? I can teach you about Einstein's theory of general relativity and vector calculus and all kinds of stuff. And boy, it might take about 5 years. It's a typical 4 or 5 year degree program to get to that level of physics. On the other hand, I can just pick up an apple and drop it, and you get the idea. You may not be able to calculate an orbit, but you certainly know how to go about your daily life in a way that is cognizant and respectful and functional with how gravity works. Let's go back to these obstacles. It's complicated. We have been for 40 years talking about the Department of Justice studies and the Chicago Alley study and all kinds of studies which try to address these many questions, but it's not working. I think that what we need to do is we need to look at another side of this problem. We need to realize that even though Flagstaff had advantages in creating its successful protection of night skies, we had observatories here in town. We got started on it back in 1958, more than 60 years ago. But we didn't have examples when we tried to come up with ways of addressing how much light is an appropriate amount of light. I saw in the Moab code, you have 50,000 lumens per acre as a standard. Flagstaff now uses 37,000. And by the way, Moab, I would point out that in the LED world, 37,000 fixture lumens is the same as 50,000 lamp lumens. And that original 50,000 lumens per acre standard was created in the context of bulb-based fixtures. So anyway, we use 37,000, which is very similar to what Moab uses. But when we did that back in 1989, people would say, is that safe? Is it dangerous? Is it supportable? We had nobody to point to, no examples to say, yes, it works. However, that's the advantage Flagstaff has. Communities now, Flagstaff offers to the rest of the dark sky community. Now you have an example, a crucial example, Flagstaff, what we call the Flagstaff solution. Most of it is not new or magical. It's just the same old stuff effectively applied or a little bit emphasized differently. But it is a on the ground tested proof of concept text example. Flagstaff has done it, and Flagstaff has not had a calamity as a result. Crime has not risen. The economy has not collapsed. All the major franchises have located Flagstaff, at least all the ones that I'm aware of. So I say Flagstaff has dropped the dark sky apple. We can continue trying to answer all of those questions with studies, and we've been doing it for 30 or 40 years, and we can continue doing it. That is part of the approach. But the example of Flagstaff should have huge value in the dark sky movement to show that you can do these things, even if they seem controversial, and we have a proof that it will not be a calamity as a result. It's simple. It's of huge value, and it can help other communities compensate for the fact that they didn't get started in 1958 or that they don't have observatories. So what can you do? You know, this is a picture, people may have seen it on Astronomy Picture of the Day in April of 2008. This is what the sky can look like now this is a little ways out of town, but it's a dramatic, not very far out of town. Here's another picture. Oh, I'm sorry, I took that one out. Also, even in the Flagstaff Buffalo Park, which is only 1.7 miles from City Hall, a town of nearly 80,000, it has a Bortle Class 4 sky. And we welcome people from across the country, as I said, about 1,000 per night, to enjoy the skies of what to an urban person is nearly a pristine sky. To a real dark sky purist like many of us here, you notice there's light pollution, but the dramatic improvement that's possible has been demonstrated by what Flagstaff has done. And these are the kinds of things that all communities of at least 80,000 and less ought to be able to reach. So the future can be darker, and we know how to do it. So thank you for your time, and I'll stop sharing the screen.
All right. Thanks very much, Chris and Alexi. So we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. There haven't been a ton of questions in the chat, so now is a great chance to put those questions in the chat. I thought I would start with one for Alexi, and maybe, maybe both of you have a little bit of comment on this, but there was a kind of question about amortization time, or what that word really means. And I actually am a little curious too. So could you tell us a little bit more about what that date, when you said there you moved the amortization date, what were the consequences there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I didn't define that during the presentation. So for us, we had a decision between what we would consider a legal non-conforming status, and it's something that we have in our code, which basically says if you have it right now, you can keep it. And then if you ever make a change, then you'll have to comply with the code. But as long as you're not making changes to your property, you're fine. That was one option for dark sky. The other one was this amortization date. And the amortization date is more saying that at a specific date, you'll be legal non-conforming until that date, and at that date, you must comply. So you have to come into compliance with the code regardless of whether you're making any other changes to your property. The hard cutoff date was a lot of discussion on our end, because we definitely had people who were like, sooner is better. We need to get all of these lights into compliance. And we also had people who are really concerned. Housing costs are high. We have a lot of local businesses that run tight budgets. And they were concerned about making that date a hard date, because it could be a financial challenge for a lot of people, and it could also be a huge compliance issue. So as part of, I believe, the dark sky community process, they suggest having it within 10 years. We had already lost, I mean, not lost, but we had 5 already pass from our first code. So what we ended up doing is adding another 5, which gave us a total of 10. We have people now, we're trying to do a lot more proactive outreach to get people to voluntarily switch over by that day. And so amortization basically means it's date in which you must be in compliance with the code. After that, you would go into a code compliance process, and our officers would, send you a letter notifying you and start working with you to make that change immediately.
Great. Maybe one quick
Now,
follow-up.
another term that's applied to that commonly for people, they may have heard of it, it's a sunset date. When the non-conforming status becomes non-compliant. These are legal planning lingo that your average person sometimes mixes up. But anyway, Arizona unfortunately is not able to do that. And that creates an enormous complication for the many communities around the country who cannot have sunset clauses like that, because then you have a mixed community of compliant and legally, is it non-conforming or is it non-compliant? And you don't know unless you have an inventory and when that lighting was changed. It's very complicated. It's enormously difficult. And I really commend you and Moab for being able to not only, first of all, I guess your state structure, your legal structure allows you to do it, but that the community has supported it. That's an enormous benefit. So eventually by 2029, then anytime you see a light that does not fit your standards, it's not compliant. You don't have to try to figure out when it was put up.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think maybe if each of you could talk about a little bit about the compliance process in your communities and how this can be binding, and maybe just also the enforcement process of like how you identify and trigger those things.
Well,
Okay,
in
go ahead, Chris.
Flagstaff, it has been an enormous headache. And part of it is, look at the ratio. We have a 10-to-1 ratio between Flagstaff and Moab. So probably 10 times as many properties are built before the code in a rough sense. And keeping track of that, what's being changed, not being changed, has been enormously difficult. And we've had a huge step forward, however, in about the last 3 years, where there is actually a staff-funded position jointly between the city and the county, whose only job is to apply standards of the lighting code and to review lighting throughout the community. That's still a very challenging job for that person to try to keep track of it. But I'd really be interested to see how it's going in Moab from Alexi's viewpoint.
Yeah, so far, our code compliance officers are mostly out during the day. So a lot of what we get is complaint based. We have discussed, especially in the winter months when the sun is setting earlier, that it would be easier for people to go out, like at 5:30 and be able to catch things instead of this time of year at like 10. So it's largely complaint based at this point for our nuisance lighting, which is immediately enforceable for us. The rest of it is not immediately enforceable. And therefore, we aren't going after any particular types of lighting. I think eventually it'll go into the same way our code officers enforce runoff provisions for construction sites or landscape maintenance provisions or other types of ordinances that the city has. It'll go into the same process where there's usually some sort of initial contact notifying the person, and then we try to go through an educational process and find the easiest way to fix something. So if that's relamping something or maybe a light that they don't even need, trying to do the low level fixes and then moving it up if it turns out it needs to be a replacement or something like that.
I have a question. Can I follow on with that? Can you describe a little bit about the financial assistance that your nonprofit has been able to provide? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, they initially applied for a grant that I think they pitched this as a lot of the lights that are being changed are older, and that if they are updated, they can be a more efficient fixture. So it saves energy, emissions, things like that. So it was grant funded from the beginning, and then we had an application process and they had some income cutoffs for it as well. And basically, if people are residents of Moab, so this is talking about residential properties as opposed to mostly commercial, they can apply for the program, they buy a fixture, and then they can get a reimbursement for however much they were approved for through the program. We have had a couple questions about it that we haven't been able to address. For example, we don't provide a contractor for that. So however people choose to install them, that is not involved in the program. And then we also have had questions about second homes and businesses. And I think the primary focus of this is for low-income residents of Moab rather than businesses or people who own multiple homes.
Is this being administered by the planning department?
This is through the nonprofit.
And can you tell us what is the grant source?
I believe the first one was through UCare, and then I believe they have another funding source for it. And I can connect somebody if they want to talk to
I'm curious to learn. You said a UK, I didn't understand it.
A Utah Clean Air Grant, I believe, was the
Oh.
first funder, and I could
Oh.
double check that to verify. I believe that was the initial funding source.
Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. I guess just related to that kind of funding issue, is there also any kind of help for businesses? Is there what's the kind of process that and also I guess I'm curious, did you have businesses in both communities that helped with this process and had where you had a lot of buy-in? And what sort of businesses were those?
You get both.
Yeah, so I've been working for the city of Moab for about 1.5 years. I know that initially there were some businesses involved, and there was also a program called Friends of the Milky Way, and that was intended to recruit new businesses for support. I don't have information on how many businesses went through that process. So I can only answer part of that question. That I'm not entirely sure how many were involved at the beginning, which, would be back in like 2016, 2019. At this point, as far as businesses coming into compliance, we don't have an assistance program for them, but we are hoping by giving people a few years of notice that they can plan it in with other regular maintenance or upgrades that they're doing to their properties.
20 years ago, we got a grant from the local power utility, a $6,000 grant to help communities or businesses come into compliance with the code. And that was backed up, almost matched with a $5,000 grant from the city. So those are possible sources. You need to be careful if you get involved with power companies, because they can sometimes try to impose these absolute efficiency drivers where the efficiency of the fixture is the only measure of environmental impact. And that can be a problem. We need to recognize that there are different dimensions to environmental impact, energy uses, Actually, efficiency is not directly an environmental impact, it's energy use, it's an impact. So if you use something more efficient, get a really efficient fixture, but you use it more, then you're not saving any energy. And how many of us haven't seen LED parking lots on in the daytime? Anybody here hasn't seen a parking lot on in the daytime? So anyway, but the other thing is that the spectrum is an issue. And sometimes when you want to go to a lighting spectrum, which is more beneficial from an environmental perspective, but has to have some compromise or relaxation, even if minor, from the efficiency side, energy companies sometimes don't see that trade-off and they won't let it happen. So it needs to be carefully balanced with dark sky concerns or broader dark skies awareness.
Right. So I think there's a question from Bradley Carlson, who can briefly maybe unmute and describe his question. And there's some very specific questions about the Moab thing as well, but I think we'll.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yep, you are.
Okay, great. I am a commissioner on the City of Reno's Historical Resources Commission. There might be a little bit of overlap in this, but we're established by a city ordinance, and for listed properties, we have a certificate of appropriateness process that we need to go through, and anybody wanting to do work on the outside of a listed building is required to come before our commission. What this might have in similarity, we're obviously talking about code and permitting issue, or maybe it's just simply complying with guidelines issue. But what I see with lighting in our own community here in Reno is a big difference between public and private. The HOA seem to be doing the best with lighting, but those are kind of few and far between. And then, you know, you might have a community that's successful, but then a bank or a commercial building might, you know, put exterior lighting boxes on the outside and just, you know, do things that private residences cannot. And there seems to be no enforcement for that. And then the public or the city's maintenance people start, you know, relamping the street lights or relamp. Actually, just down the street, there's a park that's owned by the HOA, but or run by the HOA, but it's administered by the city, and they just went through and relamped with white LEDs throughout the park, all responding to, of course, you know, perceived input, or they think that they're doing the right thing. But what I see missing in this process is, you know, some kind of a formal review and a step along the way of, as I said, like a certificate of appropriateness is required for historic properties. And it only applies to listed properties. In order to get a building permit, they need to get this along their path. For lighting, I'm not suggesting that happen. And I think what's key is having a staff person reviewing things and maybe getting their input in the review process. But I just see a real challenge as far as, you know, on one side, getting it into the code, getting into permit reviews versus guidelines and getting compliance with guidelines. And I'm an architect here, and have had board positions, including president of the Northern Nevada Chapter AIA and the Nevada State Chapter AIA. And we've been approached for providing input just in general on revisions to our zoning standards. And, you know, in the final draft, when these are adopted, a lot of it ends up going onto deaf ears, you know, and they're happy to receive our comments, but happy to ignore them as well.
Okay, could you just wrap things up, just because I think we need
that's
to
it.
a couple other questions. Okay, awesome. I think there was a question about what the color temperature regulations are in Flagstaff.
Okay, so I'll do it. I'll cover it briefly.
Yeah.
Once you go into the terminology of color temperature, you're going into the realm of white lighting of various kinds. Unfortunately, that clarity has been lost even by the dark sky advocates when they're talking about low color temperature and amber, almost as if they're interchangeable. They're not. Low color temperature lights are still white lights, and I saw somebody in the notes mentioning that, or the chat mentioning that. All of them, even the lowest practical ones, still have substantial amounts or substantially increased impacts on sky. Amber basically doesn't have any green or blue. So what we need to work on is green or amber lighting for most lighting, and the standards that we use in Flagstaff and have used for 30 years, more than 30 years, 35 years, is amber lighting is applied to general area lighting, what's called class 2 in some lighting codes. That means roadways and parking lots and security lighting behind buildings, things like that. That's where color rendition is of less high priority and lower environmental impact is of higher priority. It turns out that about 3/4 of the lighting, at least in the Flagstaff study I did back in the early 2000s, 3/4 of it is that class 2 lighting. So you can allow white lighting in situations and applications where people are out there socializing, eating, selling products, where color rendition is important. But we should not be relaxing our standards and thinking that low color temperature is as good as an amber light for general lighting.
And so is that for that kind of actual measurement that you do you use a spectrum measurement? How is that defined?
That is a topic for a whole nother semester,
Okay.
a whole nother topic. Or
do you have any good resources to point? Someone asked for resources pointing to that.
Let me express sympathy for all of the planners on this attendance here who have to deal with LEDs in the modern world, because spectrum has become complete wild card in everything. Even trying to measure a CCT to confirm that it conforms to your standard is very difficult. And so likewise with the amber spectrum, it is challenging to find ways that are, I mean, somebody with a spectrograph can do it, but most people don't have that, let alone even illuminance meters. You know, people on these planning departments who have standards that require illuminance standards like foot candles or lux, that's hard enough, but spectrum is even worse. So it's a difficult one. We need to push the lighting industry to start including a metric in their lighting spectra, which they do sometimes already, and it's certainly simple to do. And that's called the S/P ratio. I don't want to get into a great detail of what that means right now, but it's not CCT. CCT is meant to describe what color does that look like on the white spectrum from cool white to warm light to human eyes, daytime vision. S/P ratio talks about how bright is it at night to really dark adapted vision versus how bright is it in a parking lot level or brighter.
Thanks. Great. So I think that's the end of our Q&A, and we'll move on. I'll give it back to Lisa.
Okay, thanks, everybody. We are at time, and I've put some, this has been a wonderful presentation by Chris and Alexi. Thank you. Please extend our thanks to Corey as well. And for everybody who's joined us today, I do have some links here. Please see our feedback. If you'd like to put in your comments, I put a link there. I also have our next quarterly connections meeting is September 4th, same place, same time. And the website will have a register here in the near future. Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think you said this to me, explained this to me before the seminar, and that is that the questions that we haven't been able to get to in the chat, those will be shared with us.
Yes.
I hope, okay, because I see some questions that I'd really like to help out with.
There's some great questions, a lot of, cumulative knowledge here and cumulative questions. So this is a working process. I commend the work that's been done and applaud you as you move forward. All of you, thank you for your hard work. And we're going to have to end this webinar. And I wish you all the best. I hope to see you in September. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you to everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.